Because of my role with the Lebanon 912 Project, I'm often asked, what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And to be honest, those questions have been asked with greater frequency since we started talking about Agenda 21. In essence, the questions are looking for a specific justification as to why the Lebanon 912 Project exists. In that justification, what they're really asking us, what right do you have to question your government? I'm here tonight to address that in public, to provide an answer to that question.
Your Honor, Mayor Collison, it's only right that you should know why I, a stranger, have become involved in your affairs. It's because, like all of you here, I am a citizen of this country. That is no little honor. Men have fought revolutions, have died to be called citizen. And as citizens, we carry a burning responsibility. It means that when we elect men to public office, we cannot do it as lightly as we flip a coin. It means that after we've elected them, we can't sit back and say, our job is done. What they do now doesn't concern us. That philosophy of indifference is what the enemies of decent government want. If we allow them to have their way, to grow strong and vicious, then the heroic struggle which welded thousands of lovely towns like this into a great nation means nothing. Then we're not citizens, we're traitors. The great liberties by which we live have been bought with blood. The kind of government we get is the kind of government we want. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people can mean any kind of government. It's our duty to make it mean only one kind: uncorrupted, free, united. I believe, Mayor Collison, that I've answered your question.
It's from a 1942 film called A Stranger in Town. If you didn't recognize him, that's Frank Morgan from The Wizard of Oz. If you have an opportunity to see this film, it turns up off and on Turner Classic Movies. Check it out. It's well worth watching. We live in America. It's supposed to be a free country, one where the right of the citizens to peaceably assemble and to question their government is supposed to be a protected and a sacred right. I'm of the mindset that this is not just a sacred and a protected right, it is our duty. You see, when we no longer have this right, we can no longer be free. As people have begun to realize that our liberties and our freedoms are being challenged on a daily basis, more people are coming forward to question their government. Groups like ours exist all across this nation, and the media obsesses, as do some elected officials and citizens, to ridicule those of us who would dare to challenge public policy. Yet we have to ask ourselves, when a senator has to take to the floor of the Senate and filibuster to get a simple yes or no answer to the question, does the president have the authority to take the life of an American citizen on American soil who poses no imminent danger to the nation or to his neighbor? How can anybody not see how far we've traveled from the founders' intent? Underneath our constitutional banner on our webpage, underneath the rising sun and the banner of our newsletters and email blasts, you read these words: preserving the Constitution and our founders' principles on the local level. You see, it doesn't really matter what the issue is. Our position on that issue is based around a simple framework. Does it advance the founders' intent from their own words, or is it moving us in a vastly different direction? I've already said this, but it's simply not enough to know what we believe. It becomes essential that we know why we believe it. And that is in part why the Lebanon 912 Project has focused so much on education. Education is essential because, as important as knowing what we believe is, if we cannot make a solid case on why we believe it, we're going to have a very difficult time persuading others to stand with us. I believe that this is even more critical today than it was just 40 years ago, and the reason for this is a simple one.
If you had to identify a single threat to the future of our country, above all the others, what would it be?
No, it's not Obama. It's not. If God forbid President Obama came down with an illness, nothing would change. Nothing. I believe the greatest threat facing America, I believe this my entire adult life, is that we have not passed on what it means to be American to this generation. You cannot, let me make this is not a sweet line. This is meant literally. A society does not survive if it does not have a reason to survive. That's true for individuals. Where there is a why, there is a how. We have lost the why. The greatest generation did not teach my generation what Americanism is. It's not its fault. It wasn't taught. This goes back 100 years to John Dewey, to the importation of European professors, to our universities, to a whole host of issues. The average American who deeply loves this country and even has conservative values cannot articulate what those values are. It is no one's fault, but that is the greatest threat. When we understand this American trinity, in God we trust, liberty, e pluribus unum, that is uniquely American. It is not European. The French preferred fraternité and liberté and égalité, equality. We don't, as I explained in my talk. We believe in equality of birth, but not equality of result. When it is understood what America stands for, when it is understood that there is a moral dimension to a smaller government. It is not an economic question, it is a moral question. So the goodness that America created is jeopardized by our not knowing what we stand for. That's our greatest threat. We are our problem.
We are far from a united nation today. Volumes have been written about the polar divide that exists in this country, and far be it from me to compete with those volumes. But the way I see it, there is a divide in this nation, and it comes down to two opposing worldviews. And those views are centered around one single theme: property. Think about it. Property is the struggle of society. It's been the struggle of society since the dawn of civilization. It's actually the reason behind most wars. It's the reason empires are born, and it's the reason empires are destroyed. But property itself is not the cause. It is these two opposing worldviews on property. Now, one of these views says, I'm free. I am my own property. I am sovereign in my personhood. 100 years before the founding of our nation, John Locke wrote in his second treatise on civil government that the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, and the end why they choose and authorize a legislative. That there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the property of all members of the society. He continued to this by adding that, whenever therefore the legislative shall transgress this fundamental right of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. 1,700 years before John Locke wrote those words, a man named Marcus Tullius Cicero, who's often thought of as the first important social and political thinker to affirm unequivocally that the basic purpose of the state is for the protection of private property. Cicero wrote, "For political communities and citizenships were constituted especially so that men could hold on to what was theirs. It may be true that nature first guided men to gather in groups, but it was the hope of safeguarding their possessions that they sought their protection in these cities." He would add to this to further emphasize this position, "For as I said, it is the peculiar function of the state and the city to guarantee every man the free and undisturbed control of his own particular property." Thomas Jefferson felt that this concept of government was so important that he reflected Locke's words and Cicero's words in our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as they shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, those words, written by Jefferson, were signed by 56 of our nation's founders. Central to the founding of this nation was a firm reliance on the belief that just governments are instituted among men for the purpose of the protection of the individual property of its sovereign citizens. It was the first government in history to declare so. But wait a minute. You've been indoctrinated to believe that the whole reason we went to war was taxation without representation. I mean, it is all supposed to be about the economy, isn't it? You know, as this great nation was struggling in the birth pangs of independence, brave men and young boys grabbed their rifles and they took to the battlefields across these 13 colonies. Do you seriously think they did that because their taxes were too high? Is it possible they did it because they knew their property rights were being violated? That troops were being stationed in their homes? That land was being seized? That there were unlawful searches and seizures? James Madison said, "As a man is said to have a right to his property, he may equally be said to have a property in his rights." The colonists came here in the first place to escape two things. The first was religious persecution. They came to this new world for the right to determine for themselves how they would choose to worship their God. They came here to protect their right, their property of religious expression. And the second reason they came here was to escape the tyranny of serfdom and a feudal system of government that had permeated the European landscape. They came here for the right to truly own, to possess, to maintain, and protect their property. They came here to escape a system of lords and serfs, to escape countries where the king owned all the land, because they knew if the crown owned the land you lived on and the land you worked on, then the crown owned you. Before our Declaration of Independence, as the colonists settled in America, they established governments. And in doing so, they established charters for these governments. The majority of these charters contain specific clauses about the protection of property. And as these towns grew and populations increased, those towns became colonies. They became commonwealths. Constitutions were drafted, and in each of those constitutions you find the same protections to our individual rights to property. Our Pennsylvania Commonwealth Constitution begins with the Declaration of Rights. It's the first article. Our state constitution is clear. All men are born equally free and independent and have certain and inherent and indefeasible rights, among which are those of enjoying and defending life and liberty, of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property and reputation, and of pursuing their own happiness. It extends that protection by declaring that the people shall be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and possessions from unreasonable searches and seizures, and no warrant to search any place or to seize any person or thing shall issue without describing them as nearly as may be, nor without probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation subscribed by the affiant. Those protections not only included a protection of the ownership of property, but a protection of the right to defend that property. Pennsylvania's Constitution states that the right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves in the state shall not be questioned. Let me read that one again. The right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves in the state shall not be questioned. Let's be clear. Our Constitution is the rule of law in this state. Any law in this state has to align itself to the principles of our Constitution, and any law that's in violation of the principles is supposed to be unlawful. This simply means it's unlawful to question your right to own a gun. And it doesn't matter whether that's a legislator or a citizen or a newspaper. It's against the law. The Constitution can't be any clearer than this. A law, federal or otherwise, passed to question this right is simply unlawful in the state of Pennsylvania. There's nothing to debate here. It's plain, it's clear, it means what it says. According to our state constitution, when our Commonwealth's government violates the rights of its people and the protections afforded in their constitution, the protections to their property, it says that all power is inherent in the people and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for peace, safety, and happiness. For the advancement of these ends, they have at all times an inalienable and indefensible right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in any such matter as they may think proper. If all power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority, what kind of government is it when those protections in our Constitution are being violated? Are we a free government? As this nation struggled to come into being, there was already a divide in this nation concerning property. There was a group who believed that every human being had a right to property, and that included their life, their liberty, and their possessions. They had openly embraced the writings of Locke, who said that all mankind, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, his health, his liberty, or his possessions. But not everyone agreed. There were those who believed that others could be denied these rights. They could become the property of others. And so we saw the institution of slavery. Now, some have called this a unique American institution. Pardon my French, but that's bullshit. Slavery was imported. It wasn't just imported, it was mandated. Long before the rest of the world even knew there was an America, the Jews were slaves in Egypt. Slavery is not a unique American institution, but they want you to believe that. They want you to believe that because they want you to believe that your founders didn't know what they were talking about. Slavery is born out of the concept that individuals have no real right to property, but that we can be the property of someone else. Slavery can't come into being where laws are established to protect the individual under a Republican, not party principle, Republican form of government. Slavery can only come into being in a democracy where the majority can decide on the rights of the individual. Slavery was an imported institution. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania attempted to remove slavery, and the Crown stepped in and forbid them to do so. When the Declaration was written, it included a clause abolishing slavery. But because that declaration required unanimous consent, the southern states chose to refuse that consent, and the clause was removed. That's what democracy looks like. This conflict continued into the debates on the Constitution. And again, the ratification of the Constitution again became the consent of the southern states. These states were choosing to ignore the very rule of law, the very principles of the government that they were trying to establish. And they clung to their ability to keep people as property. There was a second class of citizen who did not get to see their rights recognized. And again, it happened because of the power of vote. It concerned the rights of women. Well, many had championed, including our founders. Read John and Abigail's letters to one another. Well, many had championed for the rights of women, their rights to property and their right to vote. There were enough who viewed women as the property of men. Now, eventually the women took to the streets. And what did they argue? They argued the principles of the Constitution. They argued for the principles that this nation was built upon. And that's how they won their right. In the end, it exemplifies the real difference between a democracy and a republic. Those who had a vision of a future where the rights of all would eventually be recognized had established a rule of law that would protect the rights of all individuals. It might have taken a while for this to be realized, but all along the way there was one thing that kept getting in their way and trying to impede that progress. It was those people who believed that you could be their property, that they had a right to take property from you. It's one of the flaws of democracy. As some have pointed out, democracy is two wolves fighting with a lamb over who is for supper. Under a republic, where the rights of the individual is protected, the lamb is safe. Under a democracy, the lamb is supper. It was democracy that saw blacks as possession, as property, and refused to recognize their individual rights to property. It was democracy that viewed women as second-class citizens and refused to recognize their individual and their sovereign rights. Understand this, that socialism can only begin in a nation that believes they are a democracy. The problem with socialism is that the central tenet is that we really have no individual inherent rights. We have no rights to begin with. In this worldview, rights originate from the state. That's your government. And the state can choose selectively who will receive those rights and who will be denied those rights. Socialism always requires one of two things to come into existence once an established government is in place. A violent revolution that will establish a government that does not protect the rights of the individual, or democracy. Fisher Ames described it this way: a democracy is a volcano which conceals the fiery materials of its own destruction. These will produce an eruption and carry desolation in their way. The known propensity of a democracy is to licentiousness, which the ambitious call, and the ignorant believe to be liberty. True liberty cannot flourish where the rights to property are not respected, where these rights are not preserved. Liberty is not the right to take from someone something that belongs to them. Once you grant a person the freedom to steal from another, you must, by its very nature, deny the one being taken from an equal protection under the law. This is not a difficult concept. You know, equality has never meant everyone has equal things. Ayn Rand, immigrated to America from St. Petersburg, Russia on February 2nd, 1905. She was witness to the Bolshevik Revolution, and she knew firsthand the dangers of socialism and how this leads to full-blown institutionalized communism. She fully understood the principles of the right to property, and she wrote an essay called The Virtue of Selfishness. I encourage you to read that. In it, she said, the protection of a right to property does not secure a right to an object. It secures a right to an action. It is not the right to an object, but to the action and the consequences of producing or earning that object. It is not a guarantee that man will earn any property, but only a guarantee that he will own it when he earns it. It is the right to gain, to keep, to use, and to dispose of material values. It is also the right to fail in that endeavor. Any material element or resource which, in order to become of use or value to men, requires the application of human knowledge and effort. That application of human knowledge and effort is also in the realm of private property, by the right of those who apply the knowledge and the effort. Just as man cannot exist without his body, no rights can exist without the right to translate one's rights into reality, to think, to work, and to keep the results, which means the right of property. The modern mystics of muscle who offer you the fraudulent alternative of human rights versus private property, as if one could exist without the other, they're making a last grotesque attempt to revive the doctrine of soul versus body. Only a ghost can exist without material property. Only a slave can work with no rights to the product of his effort. The doctrine that human rights are superior to property rights simply means that some human beings have the right to make property out of others. Since the competent have nothing to gain from the incompetent, it means that the right of the incompetent to own their betters, to use them as productive cattle. And whoever regards this as human and right has no right to the title human. You either have a right to own property, you either have a right to your property, or you are the property of others. And we are watching as this nation is becoming transformed. We were once a nation of producer-consumers. And we're rapidly becoming a nation of consumers who do not produce. We're all consumers, but the fruitful success of any nation is reliant upon a people who are both producers and consumers. When you are no longer producing, in order to survive, you still have to consume. But you're consuming what others are producing. And while it sounds like compassion, creating generations of people who are dependent on everything else to produce has consequences. You see, eventually everyone's going to have to deal with less. And less means less jobs, less economic prosperity, less consumption. And do you know what that translates into? Powerlessness. Less jobs, less economic prosperity, less to consume. And eventually, as Eric said, you are powerless. It grows the consumer base by force. As people begin to realize, if I don't have to work to provide for myself, why should I? And that shrinks the producer base even further. Margaret Thatcher's often been paraphrased, but this is what she said in its entirety. Socialist governments traditionally do make a financial mess, They always run out of other people's money. It's quite a traditional characteristic of them. Then they start to nationalize everything. And they try to control everything by other means. In doing so, they actually reduce the choices available to the ordinary person, the ordinary people. Now, she's been paraphrased as simply saying the problem with socialists is that they run out of other people's money. That's a simplified version of what she said, but she goes much further, and it's important to understand what she said in its context. The rise of the progressive movement in America has been a consistent push for the advancement of socialism, a transformation of this country away from the principles of our founders. And central to its theme is the removal of the protections of property. The property of our religious views, the property of our real estate, the property of our freedom of expression through speech and press, and the property of our personhood. They openly embrace this concept of it takes a village, which simply translates into a worldview that we, as a part of that village, are owned by the village. That we are, in fact, the property of others. Ultimately, the goal is to nationalize everything. Sound familiar? Making us so reliant on government that we become the property of government, and to remove any notion of our reliance upon ourselves for our success and for our failure. To advance this, they have taken noble words like equality and justice, and redefined and limited them through social mechanisms. They use the term social justice, social equality, and by those terms they mean something vastly different from justice and equality. By doing this, they demand the same outcome regardless of the effort. That's not justice. That's not equality. They have understood from the onset that the application of these principles requires the dismantling of the rule of law in this nation by rendering our founders' vision and our Constitution as something that is outdated, null, and void. They did this by infiltrating our institutions of higher learning, where our teachers, our lawyers, our judges, and our politicians would be trained. They did this by corrupting the principles that we are a republic. And they began to promote the concept that we are a democracy, and that under the democracy, right or wrong is an illusion. It's an illusion that is determined by the majority. The progressives brought in European socialists to teach in these universities. And these socialists embraced the principles of the Fabian Society, which gave birth to the progressive movement in America. They corrupted our history. They turned away from our founders' words to promote legislative and judicial activism. And our Constitution was now being interpreted in the context of not our founders' words and visions, but on case law and on legislation. Even when that case law and that legislation completely contradicted our founders' interpretation of the Constitution. And they found ways to reinterpret our very language, to change the meaning of words. Words like equality and justice, but also words like entitlement and welfare. Welfare means well-being. In our founders' time, and it was personal. My well-being. This may come as a surprise to you. Our founders were liberals. Read their papers. They identify themselves as liberals, but not by what we define liberals as today. See, Stephen Hopkins, when asked whether or not they could discuss independence during the Second Continental Congress, took to the floor and said, Well, in all my years, I ain't never heard, seen, or smelled an issue that was so dangerous it couldn't be talked about. That's what our founders believed. Everything could be talked about. And that's liberalism, 18th century liberalism. Let's talk about it. Let's hear all the different points in this argument. And then let's come to a conclusion. As our institutions of higher learning transformed, places that were once bastions of freedom and liberty began proclaiming the joys of socialism and communism under the principles of a democracy. And you know, we bought into it. I love Ronald Reagan. Honestly, I do. But every time he went on television and talked about our democracy, I wanted to slap him alongside the head. We bought into it. 60 years ago, many didn't recognize that democracy could be a threat. They honestly believed these things could never happen, not in America. Yet it was democracy that had innocent American citizens of Japanese ancestry rounded up and placed in detainment camps during World War II. And yet Rand Paul is ridiculed for suggesting that such a thing is possible in America. The rule of law, the protection of the rights of these U.S. citizens who were of Japanese descent was denied. And a majority vote was all it took to deny them their unalienable rights. Our nation was designed in such a way that it requires the active participation of its citizens. But in that participation, they have to be educated on the principles of freedom and liberty and property. Our schools, until the progressive takeover, were places where moral views of right and wrong were built into the teachings of the principles of liberty, freedom, and property. They were reinforced in the primers and in the students' textbooks. They reinforced the morality that my right to property was dependent upon the protection of my neighbor's rights to their property. And when I imposed upon my neighbor's rights, I was breaking the law. Not to steal, not to trespass, not to inflict bodily harm except in the case of self-defense. You see, things were right and wrong based on a moral concept. Slavery was abolished because of the moral concept. Women were given rights because of the moral principles. Civil rights were eventually recognized because of the moral principles. At the center of all of this debate was the individual to be lord and master over their own life, to be free to make the necessary decisions to protect their own sovereign and individual rights to their property of their life, their liberty, and their possessions. In this debate on Obamacare, we often hear that the majority doesn't like it. In the debate on Obamacare, we often hear how much money it's going to cost. Those things are true. We need to have those discussions. But in that discussion, we have to address, is it right or wrong? We have to go there. Obamacare must be right or wrong because it violates the principles of our freedoms and our liberties and infringes upon our protections of our right to property. And if you don't think that it does, read the bill. It's going to take you a while. But it does. Ask the Roman Catholic Church if it violates their religious principles. If it didn't violate their principles, why are there so many waivers? When we lose sight of the moral obligation of government to exist for the protection of all people and allow the majority to start making choices guided by economic benefits, horrible things can happen. The German economy of the 1920s was one of the worst economies in the history of the world. And then along came a man named Hitler. Germany was economically devastated after a draining defeat in World War I. Social spending was rising at an unbelievable rate. In 1913, the government was spending approximately 20.5 marks per resident. By 1925, it had risen to almost 65 marks per resident, and finally, in 1929, it reached over 100 marks per resident. The elevated amounts of money which were used for social spending, combined with plummeting revenues, caused continuing deficits. And eventually, the municipal finance collapsed in 1930. When Germany was at its weakest and its most vulnerable point, Hitler took his opportunity to begin his ascent to power. While the economy is down, people always look for someone, something, some place to lay the blame. Hitler's rise to power was accompanied by identifying who it was that they were supposed to blame. The target was business, corporations, organizations not friendly to the aims of the Nazi Party, and central to all of that was one religious group identified as the Jews. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Hitler's recovery involved large-scale borrowing for public expenditures, we say infrastructure. And at first, this was principally for civilian work, for railroads and canals and Germany's highway network, the Autobahn. Hitler also instituted wage and price controls. He essentially used the German government to control all industry as they nationalized everything. The German people were so devastated by their economy that as they began to see their economy reviving, they were willing to accept the denial of the rights to property of some, as long as they were personally benefiting through Hitler's social programs. Does any of this sound familiar? By late 1935, unemployment was at an end in Germany. By 1936, income had risen so high it was pulling prices up and making it possible to raise them higher. Germany, by the late 30s, had full employment, stable prices, and it was, in the industrial world, an absolutely unique achievement in economic recovery. On April 10th, 1938, parliamentary elections were held in Germany that included the recently annexed Austria. They were the final elections to the Reichstag during the Nazi rule, and they took the form of a single-question referendum asking whether voters approved of the single Nazi party list for the 813-member Reichstag, as well as the recent annexation of Austria. Turnout in this election was officially 99.5%. Of that 99.5%, 98.9% voted yes. In the case of Austria, Hitler's native soil, 99.71% of the electorate of 4,484,475 people officially went to the ballot with a positive vote total of 99.73%. It was democracy that put Hitler in power, and we need to think long and hard about that before we allow the progressives to dismantle the Electoral College. We don't need to dismantle the Electoral College. We need to go back to what the founders intended for it. Each district gets a vote. Winner take all. Thank Alexander Hamilton for that. And he did that to try to defeat John Adams. Frederick Bastiat said, socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. This is important. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialist concludes that we object to its being done at all. We disapprove of state education. The socialist says we're opposed to all education. We object to a state religion. The socialists say we want no religion at all. We object to a state-enforced equality. Then they say we are against equality. And so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we don't want the state to raise the grain. Now, if that sounds like something that isn't happening in America, I point you to an article in the Harrisburg Patriot News 2 weeks ago criticizing citizens who stood up and were suspicious about a regional comprehensive plan. And look at the quotes in that article, which claims that because these citizens oppose certain elements of that plan, that they oppose all planning altogether. I know those people who stood up at that meeting, and I know none of them believes that we shouldn't have some form of planning. Rather than doing the research that's necessary to grasp the reason for these concerns from these citizens, the indoctrination of the press turns the concerned citizen into a radical, frothing at the mouth over some conspiratorial nonsense. When this happens, the informed become fools. Because the debate's not framed around what is right and what is wrong. Because the debate, it stops being framed around the fact that governments are instituted to protect the individual's rights to property, not to take it away. And people openly accept that it's the role of our government to control our property. You know, in their own documents, the advocates for sustainable development spell out what they want to do with private property. This is Agenda 21. Land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principled instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth. Get that? If you own property, you're mean. How dare you own something? And therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it becomes a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. The provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable. Now, just in case we missed that, they set out direct objectives declaring Recommendation D1. Public ownership or effective control of the land in the public interest is the single most important means of achieving a more equitable distribution of the benefits of development whilst assuring that environmental impacts are considered. Land is a scarce resource whose management should be subject to public surveillance or control in the interest of the nation. Governments must maintain full jurisdiction and exercise complete sovereignty over such land with a view to freely planning development of human settlements. You still think this can't happen in America? The concept of public property is so alien to the principles of the founding of this nation that it's something altogether different. It's not just something a little different. If it violates the principles of the protections of individual property, the protection of life and liberty and possessions and our possessions, it's un-American. We become a traitor to the principles of America if we advance this position in any way, shape, or form at any level of government. If what I'm doing on my property is at no risk to the safety of my neighbors, if I'm not threatening their rights, then it's none of the government's damn business. You have no place regulating my garden or punishing me through taxation because I choose to improve my property. How did we get to a place where governments have a right to fine us through fees for a permit to replace our roof or put on new siding? How did we get to a place where somebody in the name of planning can come into our community, not planning from within, they come from outside, come into our community and then tell us how big our gardens can be, what and how many vegetables we can plant in that garden? How does this threaten anyone? How does this impose on the rights of my neighbor? You know, regulating the size of a doggy door isn't really about regulating the size of the doggy door. It's about regulating the size of the dog. Is it really a necessary function of government to decide how big my dog can be? It's when these planners start from a predetermined view that they own you, that you are public property. When the planners believe that you are the property of the state. And when they do this, they place you on the same playing field as a common criminal. Now, this is no wild conspiracy theory. There's evidence for anybody, and you don't have to do a whole lot of research. There are people in this country who have been arrested, fined, and even imprisoned because they grew gardens. There have been people who have been arrested, fined, and imprisoned because they collected rainwater to water those gardens. Farmers in this country have had their property seized for providing raw milk to their neighbors. There are places in America where farm fruit and vegetable stands have been shut down because these vegetables and fruits haven't gone through the food and drug inspections. We are watching as farmers across this nation are being forced into subsidy, grant, and tax relief programs to provide them from relief from regulations and taxations that was put on them by the government in the first place. All they have to do is give up a little control of their land. All they have to do is sign a paper. You know, when the government controls the food supply, the government controls everything. If you don't believe that, visit Monsanto. You don't protect a person's right to property by taxing them so hard they're forced into government programs. You don't protect a person's right to property by making sure that taxes aren't used to interfere with free market principles. You don't protect a person's right to property by using taxes to steal a portion of that land and then claim it as your own. That's not freedom, that's slavery. We're watching its senators and House members stand on the floor and defend the right to arrest an American citizen without due process and hold them for indefinite detention. That's America. But it's un-American. And people still say this can't happen in America. If you watched Rand Paul's filibuster, you heard Dick Durbin challenge Paul by asking if the government had a right to take out Osama bin Laden. as Paul was defending American citizens from the government's desire to implement presidential authority to kill Americans on American soil. I suppose it just never occurred to Durbin that not only was bin Laden not on American soil, he's not an American citizen, and he's not entitled to the rights of the protection of our Constitution. And they still say it can't happen in America. We've gotten here because as a nation we are no longer a government that is instituted for the purpose of protecting our rights to property, but a government that seeks to control every aspect of our life. It is this ideology of private property versus the worldview that all property is the property of the state. That's what they mean when they say public property. And I repeat again, you either have a right to property or you're the property of others. There are no other options. Under private property, you are sovereign. You have a right to your property. Under public property, your rights to property are gone. You become the property of whoever's in control. The Republicans and the Democrats don't give a damn because they both want to control you. And the only thing that's going to change that is you. All we watch is shifts in power. New party, new liberties, destroyed. New administration, new liberties destroyed. As a citizen of the United States of America, our founders envisioned a government that was owned by the people, not a people who were owned by their government. They openly declared our right to throw off any such government. They warned us this was going to happen. And they depend on us to stand up and do the right thing. We have a right to throw the government off the property of the government. They don't have a right to throw us off our property. The principles of accountability and responsibility are also vastly different when it comes to the concepts of private property versus public property. Under private property principles, a right to property does not mean that at birth or at some predetermined, predestined point in time in my life that I'm going to receive that property with no effort on my own part. As Ayn Rand said, it requires an action on my part to pursue that property with my intellect, with my industry. A right to property reinforces these noble characteristics of responsibility and accountability. It makes me accountable and responsible for my success and for my failure. But declaring that property means social equality or a system of all property belongs to the collective under public property, this public property worldview simply translates into from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, which means there is never really a right to property. And private property is only an illusion. The one with the ability, the one who has labored, the one who through their industry and their knowledge has earned only to have it taken from them to provide for another who won't. This produces the antithesis of responsibility and accountability. It removes responsibility for our own actions or lack of actions. It does not make us accountable to our own actions, but it makes us accountable to the actions of others. It removes responsibility from our own actions. It takes one group and it makes them totally dependent upon the actions of others for their very survival, for their food, their clothing, their housing, and that makes them slaves. And it takes the other group and it makes them totally dependent to the other people to provide for their food, their clothing, and their shelter. And that makes them slaves as well. And that's the dirty and ugly truth behind the concept of public property. It turns us all into slaves. This isn't a new debate. It's a debate that has existed as long as there has been civilization. There's always been a people who believe they have a right to their property and all the protections that accompany it. And there have always been people who believe that they have a right to the property of others. At its most basic, it is the cause of every war. But let's be clear. The aggressor in this war is never the person who is trying to protect his property. It is always the person who wants to take the property from you. The person who owns the property would just as soon be comfortable being left alone. It's at the core of the whole gun debate. That somehow when a person comes to rob you, rape you, or commit any act of violence against you, that somehow the criminal is the gun and not the aggressor. It's born out of this ridiculous notion that somehow they have a right to do this to you. And you don't have the right to protect yourself. But isn't this what you would expect? Look at our government. Look at what our government is doing. Isn't this the society that it's built? Government has become a socialized institution. You turn on television, you watch TV, you follow the media, and listen to them. Champion socialism. When an anchor can go on national television and boast about being a socialist, and it doesn't create an outcry in this country, something is wrong. It's un-American. They overregulate the job industry, driving jobs out of the country, and then they take from one group, punishing those who are still working, to give to those who aren't. After you've used up what you've paid into unemployment insurance, you go on the public dole, and the rest of society provides for you. But let's be clear. This is a problem that was created by government in the first place. The regulations and the interference with free market principles, controlling wages, controlling prices, regulating everything, they create the very reasons that they need to steal from you to provide for other people. And then they justify this as an act of compassion. And the rest of us are just supposed to accept it, go along with our lives, and pretend it's not happening. Redistribution is theft. In order to redistribute, you must take from one person that which belongs to them and give it to another while claiming that somehow they have a right to it. Well, it might make the economy of that one group a little more tolerable. There's nothing moral about it because it requires mandated theft. It also ignores that it is the individual's responsibility to demonstrate compassion through charity. Mandating theft is neither charity nor is it compassion. You can't be compassionate if you're stealing from one person to give to another. You can only demonstrate compassion if you are the one making the sacrifice, and the government isn't making the sacrifice. They're sacrificing you. You know, Al Capone helped a lot of people in difficult economic times. He was able to help them because he threatened the property of other people. He violated the rights of others. He fixed prices. He manipulated business through intimidation. And yet there were many who benefited by Capone. And those people spoke highly of him. But to do so, they had to ignore the abuses that he was committing to other people. To the recipient, Capone was generous. To anyone who resisted him, their property, their liberty, and their life was violated. Yes. In the process, you know, Capone made himself incredibly wealthy. He made millions of dollars by making bootleg liquor, and in the process, he employed bartenders, car dealers, pimps, and other people throughout Chicago and beyond. He improved the economy in Chicago, but he did so in a way that he had no moral compass. How anybody can't see that the very reasons we felt that man in the middle had to go to jail is what our government is doing to us right now. You can't complain compassion if you're beating up one person to provide relief to another. The two actions have to cancel one another out. True freedom and liberty does have a price, and that price is responsibility and accountability. If I have the freedom to make bad choices, then I must have the freedom to fail. I must also be held accountable for that failure. It requires that while expressing my freedoms and my liberties, I have the full respect of the freedoms and liberties of others in mind. If I abuse another's freedoms or liberties, then government is to be instituted for the protection of their property. They have an obligation to intervene and through due process, exact an appropriate punishment. Outside of that realm, then the government is just supposed to get the hell out of the way. Taxation should exist to provide for the necessary functions of government. That includes things like a police force designated to protect my rights, not deny me of them. Taxation and laws should never be levied to give one group an advantage while punishing others. Governments picking winners and losers is not a just government. Governments bailing out failed companies is not a just government. Governments institutionalizing myriads of agencies for the purpose of bypassing legislative authority granted solely to Congress and placing those agencies under the office of the president is not a just government. Not a single one of those agencies are elected by the people, and yet every one of them has the authority to regulate, which is the equivalence of legislating. And every one of them has the power to enforce those regulations. Our Constitution is clear. All legislative authority is to be in our Congress, because as an elected body, they're accountable to the people. The office of the president was never intended to be legislative. Certainly not through empowered agencies that are sucking dry the very sustenance of this nation. The Department of Agriculture, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, has one employee for every 11.5 people who work on a farm. The 2012 budget for this department was $121.9 billion, with another $28.8 billion for discretionary spending, and that's just one department. That's not done. As to the number of bureaucracies in our government, even the experts can't agree on the total number of federal government agencies, commissions, and departments. Most estimates suggest that there are probably more than 2,000. They each have an area of specialization, some much broader than others, but their duties overlap, making administration next to impossible. To complicate things even more, many of these agencies have counterparts at the state and the local level. Most of them are under the control of the president, not the legislative body of government. And this didn't happen because of the Democrats, and it didn't happen because of the Republicans. It happened because of the Democrats and the Republicans. They're both doing this to us. They share an equal role in the creation of this monstrosity. And occasionally we get a Ronald Reagan who comes along and starts cutting the size of government. But they do so without regulating its rebirth. It's not enough to reduce the size of government and cut spending. The solution has to be to make sure that the beast doesn't come back from the dead. The legislation has to enact rules that don't allow these institutions to come back into power again. As we move forward, it's important that we remember that no issue can be determined right or wrong constitutional or unconstitutional, based solely on the economy. It's an important factor, but not solely on this. And no issue can be determined right or wrong based on majority opinion. It's an important factor to consider, but in the end, the determination of right or wrong has to be determined by a moral code, and that moral code is to be found in the Constitution and our Bill of Rights, which requires our Declaration of Independence. In the grievances listed in our Declaration, we read the abuses of the king concerning our property rights. And those grievances are exactly what this new government was trying to protect us from. I encourage you, go home, read those grievances, and as you do, ask yourselves which of them aren't being implemented in America today. It's important to know what our founding documents meant in the words of our founders. And to best understand this, we have countless original documents that are available freely for us to read. We don't need case law from the last 100 years, and we don't need the opinions of a president who has never understood that the purpose of the Constitution was to limit government, not to expand it, or certainly not the opinions of administration that is far more sympathetic to the enemies of the United States of America than they are to the principles that allowed America to become the greatest nation in the world. As long as we followed the principles of freedom and liberty through the protection of private property, America grew. It prospered because of the principles of free market society that encouraged personal responsibility and accountability in the pursuit of happiness. When we began to remove these principles, freedom and liberty began to slip from us. And what followed? The economy. As we openly embraced and institutionalized socialism through the war on poverty that began in the 1960s, we did nothing to change the percentage of people in poverty. What we did was started killing jobs, destroying home ownership, and establishing a government that's little more than a leech sucking the blood from our economy, destroying jobs and decimating the American dream. It's not the government's role to give things to us. It's the government's job to protect the things that we pursued on our own. It's the government's job to protect these things we own from enemies, foreign and domestic. It's the government's duty to get out of the way of the people, to get out of the way of business and of property, and allow the American dream to become a reality once again. This was never a dream just for America. It was a dream that once led the world to aspire to the principles and freedom of liberty through the full realization of a role of government in protecting the rights of the individual to truly own, maintain, and protect their property. During this discussion, you have seen the logo of the Lebanon 912 Project displayed as it is right now. And we are sometimes asked, why the crown? For those of you who don't know, I asked you to bear with me just a little bit longer. The statue we call the Statue of Liberty was actually titled Liberty, Enlightening the World by its sculptor Frederick Bartholdi. Friedrich. It was not Bartholdi's first attempt at this type of a statue. His first proposal was actually for the northern entrance to the Suez Canal, and it was inspired by the ancient Colossus of Rhodes. It too was a large robed female bearing a torch. It failed. It was rejected. A proposal was made to the American government that modified the Suez Colossus with the inclusion of a crown on her head. And she was also designed to be in motion. While today we see the statue as a symbol of immigration, that was not the sculptor's intention when he designed her. Having made a trip to New York City, he passed Bedloe Island. And there he saw Fort Wood erected on that island. The star shape that was traditional of forts during the early history of the American Revolution is still a part of her pedestal. He saw this as the perfect location for his statue of liberty enlightening the world. As I said, the statue was constructed to appear in motion. You will note she's not moving towards America. She doesn't even face America. She's walking away from America out to the rest of the world. Bartholdi was telling us liberty was not to remain in this country. Liberty was to move out to all corners of the world. Liberty was not to be shackled in America. And he exemplified this to the broken chains around her feet. It had nothing to do with slavery. And if they teach you that, they're lying to you. Liberty wasn't for America alone. It was not to be bound to its shores. The principles of American liberty as exemplified in the statue was a principle for the entire world. The tablet Lady Liberty carries is in the shape of a keystone. In architecture, a keystone is a central stone at the summit of an arch, locking the whole together. Keystone is used to exemplify. It's a term that's used to exemplify essential principles, part of its policy, its system, on which everything else depends. And on the keystone is a date. It's not the date of the Constitution. It's not the date of the Bill of Rights. It's not the date that we finally won our independence from England. On it is the date of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The crown of liberty is unlike any crown ever seen before. These points of her crown do not point upward, which is traditional of a crown. They point outward. There are 7 points, each representing the 7 continents of the world. The symbolism was one where American liberty, once realized in America, would guide the world to her principles of liberty for all, and then the world would know freedom. It was her crown of glory. This guiding principle that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, just governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. You can ask, why do we exist? What right do we have to challenge our government, whether that's at the local, the state, or the federal level? I say it's my right as an American citizen. It is my right as a citizen of the United States of America. And to shackle us not to be able to stand up for the principles of American life, liberty, and property is against the very principles upon which this nation was born. It is not un-American to challenge the government when they threaten our freedoms and liberties, but it is un-American to remain silent. Yes, I am a citizen of this country, and that is no little honor. But as citizens, we carry a burning responsibility, and it means that when we elect men and women to public office, we cannot do it as lightly as we flip a coin. It means that after we've elected them, we cannot sit back and say our job is done. What they do now no longer concerns us. That philosophy of indifference is what the enemies of this nation want. If we allow them to have their way, to grow strong and vicious, then the heroic struggle which wielded thousands of towns like this one into one great nation means nothing. Then we are not her citizens. We are her traitors. The great liberties by which we live have been bought with blood, but the kind of government we have is the kind of government that we, the people, give to ourselves. A government by the people, for the people can mean any kind of government, but it's our duty to make it mean one kind, uncorruptible and truly free. Yes, I am a citizen of this country, and that is no little honor.